With everything going on right now in the world with regards to the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests that have been taking place around the globe, we have decided to use this moment in time to address some very specific issues relevant to us as a Muslim community as well.
As an organization, we've always been focused on sharing Muslim stories. A story that is not heard enough, but told too often, is the story of how our black brothers and sisters are treated in our society. There are injustices taking place that need to be addressed. It's on us, as Muslims and as people, to stand in solidarity with those fighting for justice, accountability, and change. We, the Mosquers, stand by the Black Lives Matter movement and recognize that it's on us to change these deeply rooted systems built on racism, oppression, and white supremacy. We need to educate ourselves.
We need to acknowledge that there are instances of racism that take place within our own Muslim communities that we have to actively confront. We need to acknowledge that the larger Muslim community has often turned their backs on Black people who continue to fight for their right to exist. We, the Mosquers, need to better showcase stories of Black creatives within our community. We, the community, need to donate to organizations supporting Black lives, Black freedom, and Black art. Now is the time to amplify Black voices. Now is the time to rally and stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters. This is not the time to mention other ongoing struggles. This is not the time to claim ignorance. Read, learn, speak, act.
Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by one of our board members, Omar Farah, as well as Bashir Mohamed, a very strong advocate for the Black community here in Edmonton. Take it away, Omar.
All right. Hello to everyone tuning in. Today we have an incredible soul in the building and in your ears. Coming to you live right now is Omar Farah over here. And in the building we have brother Bashir Mohamed, who is an Edmonton activist, a community activist, a writer, an avid biker, and a brother who definitely can speak a lot more eloquently than I can about virtually anything. Bashir is a prominent member of Edmonton's Black community and has an extensive knowledge on the history of Black Canadians in Edmonton and Alberta. And fun fact, was once targeted by an anime neo-Nazi website. I'm happy to be here with you, man. I'm happy to have the chance to have this conversation. I know I'm not usually the one that's on this podcast, but I was graciously given the opportunity here by the team over at Mosquers just because of everything that's going on and the political climate that we're in today. I thought if this is such an incredible platform and the ears that we can reach together, I'm hoping that we could enlighten some folks both in Edmonton, across Canada, the folks that are listening out in the States, and wherever you might be tuning in from. So why don't we just kind of start us off, Bashir, with maybe giving the folks that might not be aware, in your own words, like what's happening in Canada and in America right now? Like what is...
Yeah, I think yeah, to be honest, I'm actually really confused about this moment. It's a very kind of weird position to be in as someone who's kind of done similar work over the last few years and then suddenly have this massive interest. So I think what we're seeing is a mass public interest and desire for there to be action and systemic change related to police misconduct, but also racism and specifically anti-black racism. So yeah, like it's a strange moment just seeing kind of this just seeing this mass support, and I'm not sure how else to describe it. I'm sure when this moment passes and whatever happens in this moment happens, people will have more eloquent ways to I think describe it.
Hmm. One of the things that I think, a lot of people, especially here in Canada, tend to think is that what's happening right now is very much an American problem. It's one that's been born out of slavery that has created institutionalized racism within the United States, and that's a problem that is for them to handle. We've got our own issues, indigenous rights and so on and so forth. How right or wrong is that belief?
Yeah, I think so. I think for some context, to kind of speak to my past a little bit, anytime I've worked on anything that's had to do with anti-racism or whatever, the usually the number one comment I get from detractors or whatever is, at least we're better than at least we're better than the United States. These problems don't happen here. Things are different, and if things do happen here, they're often one-offs. So I think putting that in this context makes a lot of sense because there's a strong desire from our political leadership, but also police forces, for people to see that as true, for people to see these rallies in Canada as solidarity rallies to what's happening in the US, and not necessarily rallies that are intended to have systemic change here. Because I think if they allow that to happen, if we allow that to happen, they effectively avoid this moment and avoid being accountable. So I think a large part of why that idea exists is the lack of local education. So specifically when it comes to policing, like we have major systemic issues here. The problem is a lot of our data is actually not collected. I remember, sorry to kind of jump around a bit, but a few years ago when I was with Black Lives Matter, yeah, no worries. A few years ago when I was with Black Lives Matter Edmonton, we worked on carding issue. We worked on the carding issue. For those who don't know, carding is it's also known as street checks. It's when an individual is stopped and that individual's data is collected, and they're stopped for no actual like legitimate reason. So it's mostly just like a random stop. And the reason we collected that data was we saw in 2017 the Toronto data came out, and I had a meeting with cops and I asked the cops if we had a similar problem, and they said no. I didn't believe them, so I filed a FOIP and we got the data, and it showed that there was actually a problem. And in almost every other case when it comes to race, whenever the data is uncovered, it actually shows there to be a systemic issue. So I think, unfortunately, though, a lot of Edmontonians are not aware of this because of how well it's been hidden. How well this, I think, systemic Canadian and Edmontonian racism has been hidden. So I think that ties into a lot of this.
So can you speak a little more to like what the problem is with carding, like how what was the issue that came out of that Toronto data and that could potentially translate to Edmonton as well?
Yeah. So when it comes to the actual practice, there is a report in Toronto called the Dube-Gartner report, and it was meant to review carding, I think, in Ontario, or it could have just been in Toronto. But anyways, that report found that there's actually no like police benefit to carding. Like police said it was intelligence reports and everything, but they were never actually able to articulate how it actually benefited them. And that was actually similar in with the Edmonton Police Service, because after our data was released, the Edmonton Police Commission launched a review, and there wasn't any compelling reasons for like operational reasons for why there should actually be carding, except vague reasons around intelligence and like having the information. But to talk about the systemic issue with it, what we found was that Black people were 5 times more likely to be carded. Indigenous women were 12 times more likely to be carded. So there was a clear systemic problem there, with some groups being more impacted than other groups. And it's funny because some people will say that the reason why these demographics are more affected, and we straight up heard this from police. And I have to make this clear: like police said this. They said that the reason we hear this is the reason there's a disparity in carding stats is because these groups commit more crime. But when you look at carding and street checks, the central criteria there is that they're not suspected of doing anything. So this person is not doing a crime, like they're just a random person. So it has to go like a step further for why these disparities exist. So that's, I guess, the crux of the issue with carding. And to speak a little bit about the Edmonton case, you're probably seeing a lot of people now, like in 2020, call for the end of carding. Carding didn't actually end in Edmonton; it was just heavily declined. So when we got the data, there was about 27,000 cases a year. Now it's been heavily cut down. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's a very small percentage of what it used to be before. However, the practice still exists. Oh, sorry. To clarify, quarterly they now have to provide reports to the police commission on every single case, and every single carding incident is actually reviewed now. So carding still exists. It's just under more scrutiny, I guess. And oddly enough, well, not oddly enough, the Edmonton Police Service is actually one of the most vocal defenders of carding. So the chief of police just this fall actually defended it. So even though it's been heavily cut, it still exists. And actually, this is one of my major regrets, I think, living in Edmonton and working on these issues, is that we didn't really go all the way. And I actually count this not as a success because we weren't able to fully eliminate carding. But anyways, sorry for jumping around all over.
No, not at all. I mean, I think part of what we want to do today is have an open conversation, something that maybe is a little bit more free flowing than a typical interview style. So I appreciate that, and I hope we can have more of a dialogue than anything today. But just continuing on. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries. I was just gonna say I should probably give some context for people about who exactly I am. So I grew up in Edmonton. I
Yeah,
did all my schooling
yeah. I
here.
was actually gonna say maybe it would be very very helpful for people to get a little
Yeah,
bit more of your background. Yeah, please.
yeah, for sure. So I grew up in Edmonton. I did all my schooling here, from elementary to university. I worked in I worked so after I graduated university, I graduated with a poli sci degree minor in sociology. I worked in the province for a few years, and throughout all that time, I was kind of involved in random things that happened in Edmonton. I don't really know how else to put it. The first, like, I guess, notable thing I did was when I was 17 and still in grade 12. The government of Canada cut healthcare benefits for refugees. It was called the Interim Federal Health Program, and the guy who actually cut it was Immigration Minister Jason Kenney, who's now Premier of Alberta. I'm not sure if you remember what happened, but I'll just give a quick summary because this is, I guess, my introduction to everything. So for context, I walk into my grade 12 social studies class. Mr. Coswin, my teacher, he has a paper that's out, and I pick it up and I'm reading the Edmonton Journal, and there's a headline saying that doctors believe cuts to refugee healthcare are cruel, or it was something like that. And this kind of blew my mind. It was actually the first time I was, I guess, driven to action. So I wanted to do something, so I did my own mini protest, which was printing off homemade little information pamphlets about the issue, who to call, and I put on a suit and tie and actually walked around the ledge grounds and I just talked to people. It was a bad idea because people thought I was in a cult because I was wearing all that. Um, and yeah, that was my first protest. And I reached out to this group that formed called Doctors for Refugee Healthcare, and it was physicians, lawyers, refugees, people who really cared about this issue. And their strategy to advocate against the cuts was to interrupt ministers because ministers refused to have meetings with them. Now, no one could actually get Jason Kenney. And I remember, I think this was June or July or something. Um, we found out that Jason Kenney was coming to Edmonton. And I was like one of the few people in the Edmonton group, that was actually active. We had a few members, but I think, the only one that was actually like a refugee. So they brought this up, and up until this point, it was only doctors who actually interrupted ministers and asked them questions. So I thought, okay, this is something I want to do. So it was at the Aviation Museum on Kingsway. I paid the $40 to get a ticket. It was called a barbecue, but there actually wasn't a barbecue. It was actually catering. But yeah, it was a fundraiser for like the Conservative Party or whatever. And I walk in, I sit at the very front, and there's no Q&A period. And Jason Kenney gets up and he starts speaking. So I stand up and I say, Minister Kenney, I'm a refugee. And before I could say anything, four guys grabbed me, dragged me out, and actually arrested me. And when I asked why they arrested me, they said they were charging me for assault because I shoved one of the guys out of the way. But then video came out. So actually, they put me in handcuffs. They drove me all the way to the downtown police station. I was in custody, and then after like an hour or maybe a couple hours or whatever, they saw a video that showed I didn't assault anyone like intensely, I guess, and they ended up dropping the charges. Now, this blew up. I don't want to get into it, but I had like a huge public thing with like Jason Kenney. And long story short, this advocacy was successful, and they ended up reversing the cuts. Um, fun fact, by the way, Jason Kenney is actually the guy who gave me my Canadian citizenship. He actually signed, like, my certificate of citizenship has a signature on it. So me and him have a very long history.
Yeah, no kidding. A love-hate relationship almost. Yeah.
Yeah. So after that, I was involved in a few things. I was involved with Black Lives Matter Edmonton. I was the co-chair for policing, worked on the carding issue. Since then, I've kind of been a freelance writer. I've done my own thing. I also helped out on the Justice for ML case, the Catholic School Board. But that's just a long-winded summary of kind of who I am.
That is very, very, very summarized, and we both know it. This guy has done a whole lot more, man. I feel like back in the day, I was seeing him, the little threads that parents be sending around on WhatsApp, like, look at this story, look at this story. Almost every other one was you out there fighting the good fight, saying the good word. And I like to give people their roses while they're still around. So just to let you know that we do appreciate you and everything that you've been doing and continue to do on behalf of not just our community, but the Black community at large, the immigrant community, the Somali community. We all appreciate you, man. So just to dive back into the conversation here, like uh, I have some questions with regards to your opinions on like the protests and everything that's going on, and whether you think they're sufficient. Is it going to get things done? Is this something that you feel is just there to stroke people's egos on a Friday night after they've been locked up for about 5 months or however long it feels at this point? Because that was my sentiment, at least at first, when I came and seen whatever 10, 15,000 people all in a field preaching kumbaya, although it is a nice sight to see these random folks that you've never seen in your life honking their horns in support of your life, it mattering, your existence, being of worth. It's a strange feeling, and just to get your 2 cents on that, because it's definitely something that's been on all of our minds.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about that for a while, and I guess for me, my main concern is that. So I guess for some context, the Justice for Amel stuff. He was an 11-year-old black kid that was accused of being. Yeah, he wore do-rag to school. He was accused of being in a gang, and what ended up happening was that we like basically fought them for 9 months to just get them to apologize. A whole bunch of other stuff happened, but it was a 9-month campaign. And when we were organizing back then, we'd maybe get 10, 20 people out at things, usually less. And suddenly you see, or I see, like 10, 15,000 people there shouting Black Lives Matter. And my fear, my main fear is that a year from now, we go back to having 10, 15, 20 people show up. So I try not to think too much about the motives of why people were there. I think, you know, that having that crowd there was good. My only, I guess, concern with the protest itself is that there's a lack of focus on local issues, which makes the likelihood of the momentum going away much higher. However, people are still interested, and I think this is where I can maybe kind of come in, which is why I like put together that toolkit, which is why I've been kind of focused on, you know, sharing these local issues. And yeah, oh yeah, and I guess like to contrast it, I don't know if you saw in Minneapolis.
Yeah, they have actual, well, or at least signs of actual change in how they've decided to do away with police in the
Yeah,
near
but did you see the
future.
video of their mayor at their protest?
I died.
Yeah,
Oh my God.
yeah. Imagine if that happened with Don Iveson at like on Friday, because he's like he votes for the police budget. He was responsible for transit
Mhm.
peace officers. He has major sway in our city. There's also school board trustees there. Imagine if we did that for school board trustees when it comes to school resource officers. Uh,
Do you mind giving the people that might not have seen the video some context there on what you're talking about with what happened in Minneapolis
Yeah,
there?
so their mayor like showed up to their protest, and
Hmm.
like the organizers literally just ask him a bunch of questions, like if he's going to defund police and everything, and he gives like very politician answers. Like, so this mayor is like seen as progressive, right? And he's giving like very like flowy answers that seem good on the surface. And then they just ask him straight up, "Are you going to defund police?" And he doesn't answer. So they literally just tell him to go away, and he does a walk of shame. Like thousands upon thousands of people are just chirping this guy, and it's like the most surreal thing. So I think like when we tie that to Friday's protest, I think it's unfortunate that we weren't able to directly challenge like municipal politicians, provincial politicians who
Hmm.
may have been there. So
Hmm.
yeah, I don't want to like dwell on that too much. I don't want to dwell on I think what the negative parts were, but
Yeah.
I think the only consequence of not having that much of a local focus is the lack of momentum. Sorry, there is one thing I want to bring up, but it's police. It's the way police
Yeah.
have been navigating this moment. They've
And I
been.
think,
Sorry, go ahead.
oh, no, I was just going to say, I think that is a topic that we want to cover in pretty significant detail if we can here, in terms of the interaction between police uh, and the Black community more generally, but even more specifically around this movement. But before we do that, something that you mentioned as it relates to the Minneapolis mayor and the rhetoric around defunding the police, I want to make sure that people who are listening to this podcast get a little bit more context, right? Because I think sometimes, we go down these paths of conversation without maybe fully understanding that a lot of people are just, even to this day, unfamiliar with a lot of what's going on in terms of the conversation, right? You hear things like abolish the police or defund the police, and to a lot of people that sounds very, very radical, right? It sounds like something that is just incredibly extreme and not something that anybody wants to get behind. So before we dive into specifics as it relates to the Edmonton police, or more specifically with, specific cities, can you give a little bit of a context around what does it mean when people say abolish the police or defund the police?
Yeah, essentially what they're saying is that the funds could go towards like more community based resources, like that what police actually do like doesn't necessarily have to be done by someone who's armed and who has the power to like assault someone, because police, uh, aside from the military, we actually give them a monopoly on violence. And it's kind of surreal that we've kind of assigned them all these different roles. Like we assign them the roles of doing mental health checkups, like someone who's armed. We assign them roles of being school resource officers to do community engagement in schools, but at the same time, they also arrest students in our very own schools. I'm sure I'll talk about that later. So when we talk about defunding police, it's not that the money will suddenly disappear. Is that people want the money to go towards things that will lead to, I guess, less violent encounters, or minimize the possibility of violent encounters. And to speak about this, I understand it seems like a radical idea, but I think a question any listener has to ask themselves is, why does defunding police sound radical, but defunding education and defunding transit are so normal in our society, like in North America? Like, I know for a fact, like fares go up all the time within our transit service. There's cuts all the time when it comes to like cutting future LRT lines. When it comes to education, our class sizes are growing bigger and bigger. Why is it that when it comes to police, there's not this understanding that things should be cut, or at the very least be on the table?
Yeah,
It's almost like an impossible policy proposal.
and I think a lot of it also has to do with the lack of understanding that people don't even recognize how much funding goes towards the police, right? And I think when you start to see some of the numbers, especially in comparison to some of the other social programs, I mean, it's an insane disparity.
Yeah,
Like
I
I think
think. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just remember looking at the numbers not too long ago about how much does, like, specifically for Edmonton, I guess in this case, how much the EPS does receive, and like year after year, the budget increases that they've been seeing, and they have a proposal that's already out for what the funding allocation is supposed to look like for the coming, I think it's like 3 4 years from now until 2022, and they have a nearly gradual increase from 356 million projected budget for last year, to 2022, where it goes up by almost 50 million, going up to 406 million. Meanwhile, the amount that they have allocated towards social development each year is only a tenth of that each year, and is set to decline year after year after year after year until that point. Funding is 10 times higher for police as it is for social development, for things that could like actually bring about change in communities, like community initiatives, social work, violence prevention, indigenous relations, housing and homelessness. We give
Hmm.
10 times more funds to police than we do to these measures
And that's
that,
Edmonton.
and that's in our city specifically right now.
Hmm.
So what is it about the narrative that you think that's out there that people are so against taking money away from the police, thinking that, oh, that's going to make response times go from 5 minutes to 10 minutes now if we're giving them less? And we're not necessarily saying
Yeah.
cut them out entirely. Some cities are and looking for alternatives there. But like you just mentioned, people have no problems when provincial governments cut funds for healthcare workers, especially in times like right now when Lord knows that they need it, or cuts to education, making our classrooms bigger. But the second that we try to take a couple dollars out of sergeants' pockets, outrage,
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. I think when it comes to that, like people have a very valid fear, and I think that fear unfortunately has been created by police, and also how police have been militarized.
Mm-hmm.
There's this Globe and Mail article actually about SWAT response times, and I think the nationwide stat is that I forget the start point, but in the last few decades, SWAT teams have been used 2,000% more uh, than than they actually have in the past. And just Google, I think Globe and Mail SWAT Canada. You should be able to find this. But there's a trend of, obviously our police being more militarized, especially in Canada too. Like we have armored vehicles that are used for things that may in the past have been done by a few cops, but now, like for example a warrant or whatever, but now it's like an armored vehicle, guys in military, style clothing and everything. So I actually, I think, yeah. So that fear is valid. I understand when people have that fear, but at the same time, like we need to understand that there are better ways of doing things. A lot of modern policing in North America is based off this guy named Sir Peel in the UK, and he created the Peelian principles of policing, and 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 his number one thing was the police are the people and the people are the police, which essentially is the legitimacy of the people, or the legitimacy of the police depends on the people's trust of them.
Mm-hmm.
So when police become further and further away of resembling its citizens,
Mm-hmm.
then then at that point is where policing loses uh, its power, but also uh, its intended purpose. So I think that's something that needs to be understood. I know it's a much larger conversation, but there's a lot of really good resources around this. I know
Mm-hmm.
the Black Lives Matter Edmonton chapter put out some resources on this. I think Progress Alberta put out some resources on this. But thankfully, there's a lot of readings about this, and I just encourage people to look at it and think about uh, other options when it comes to policing.
Yeah, and I think one thing too that people aren't really recognizing is that there's actual research based facts that state that, investing in more social workers, more like social services to address homelessness, to address poverty, to address any type of other discrimination that's taking place, like that's what actually has better outcomes compared to investing in police. And so, where do you think that level of misunderstanding occurs? Because I think I agree with you. I think people have the fear that if we have less police on the streets, when there's a really violent crime or something taking place, even though crime has gone down historically, like comparatively, it's at lower rates right now. But people are afraid that when something happens, if we have less police, if response times are longer, that's the worst case scenario. So where is that kind of cognitive dissonance that's happening, where even though there's research that says that investing in these other areas will lead to better outcomes for the community as a whole, but people are thinking that the police need to be the answer?
Yeah, uh, I think it's police are really good with PR, especially in this moment. And sorry, I meant to mention this before, but if you look at how Edmonton police are kind of dealing with this moment, they're doing it in a very smart way. If you look at other cities in the U.S. that responded with riot police and everything, it just made things worse for them because videos came out of them like beating up just peaceful people. While other cities took a different approach. Like I know Seattle just pulled off their riot police and are now just letting people do whatever. And the benefit with that is that it makes people like it lowers people's frustrations and it decreases the likelihood of things getting really intense. Edmonton police have done something really smart where they've been on a media offensive and basically declared themselves as a compassionate force. And when it comes to this protest on Friday, even when it's built over, after it officially ended, yeah, they didn't actually crack down. They actually took it. They actually took a knee. However, it's important to mention that while they're doing all this same week they put out a statement justifying. So, for context, a couple of years ago, an officer. It's kind of a sort of a long story, but anyways, it was it was an unarmed black man, wasn't doing anything violent. Officers tried to arrest him, toss him on the ground, and actually put their knee against his neck. So same position, same position uh, as yeah as uh, as uh, as as George. So that, but the video was just released this week because the guy who was the victim decided it was something people should see, and the police this week justified it. They said that it was reasonable because they said that he was violent. They said that he pushed an officer. The important thing to note is that there's been no charges laid against him, and the charges of obstruction were actually dropped. So it's actually funny because if you look at the police timeline, like on their Twitter, you have the video of them acknowledging systemic racism, and then directly above it, you have a video, a statement of them justifying, yeah, using violence, but also casting an unarmed black man as actually aggressive. So the police strategy here is smart because their intended purpose of doing this is to minimize criticism, to minimize focus on them, so that they can escape this moment and continue not really having that much accountability. Sorry for kind of going over, but I hope that makes sense.
No, I think that's really important for people to hear. And I also just wanted to ask, so because people kind of might not understand the history of police, and I think that that's something that I myself have been really like happy that people are bringing that to the forefront, is that historically police were not made to protect people. It was like they were kind of made to protect property, but then also the property of those who were in power. And so they were not ever created with the intention of being a, serve and protect for those who are oppressed or marginalized or racialized. So can you speak to that history, and particularly with regards to that history in Canada? Because I think a lot of people don't know about that either.
Yeah, so one thing I've been seeing spread a lot is how policing originated in like slave patrols, which is true for the US. Now in Canada, we did actually, like, we had slavery too for like over 200 years, and we did have people who hunted down slaves. But Canadian policing is interesting because if you look at the origins of the RCMP, they were actually a military force. So they actually fought battles. They put down rebellions by indigenous people, and that's the origin of the RCMP. And I think that's like more problematic than than the U.S. context with slave patrols, because you essentially have this militarized force that fought in combat, that that killed people, that actually committed war crimes, and it's the same organization that polices across Canada. And a lot of local police services, they either take inspiration from the RCMP, um, or for example, they work very closely with them. Like Kingsway is where I think it's called K Division in Alberta is actually located. So I think that that's important to understand. When you look at Edmonton and early policing, the police love whitewashing their history, but early Edmonton policing targeted black people, especially black women. Um, for context, there's a large wave of black immigration that came between 1910 and 1912. I actually wrote an article about this. But long story short, they saw black women as aggressive, as deviant, unfortunately, because uh, they felt that a lot of black women were entering sex work, and they also felt that black women were not only doing that, but were also assaulting white people. So it's kind of wild if you look at this period of time between like 1910 to 1918. You see all these news articles that make black women seem evil, and as a matter of fact, you see police statements and city prosecutors saying very terrible things about black people in Edmonton. Um, I think the city prosecutor even said that the better their kind put several street rails between themselves and Edmonton, the better Edmonton will be. If you put this into contrast of how white people were policed and portrayed in media, it's completely different. It was actually kind of weird. I actually wrote an op-ed about this for the Edmonton Journal on Thursday, or I guess it was released Friday. But in that op-ed, so I was writing that op-ed in the very same paper that 100 years ago demonized black people and black women. So I think that context of policing is really important to understand, especially when we talk about Canada and defunding police. The other thing too is critics will say, "Oh, that was 100 years ago, 200 years ago, whatever." Sure, but the issues haven't gone away. Like there's been systemic issues like police brutality, whatever, and it's a long history that you can draw a straight line from now to then. If that history was broken up and there was like actual reconciliation in between, then sure, that argument of it being 100 years ago can be valid. but we've never seriously grappled with this before. So I think that context is important for people to understand.
Do you think, at least in Canada, the issue with the police force is about anti-blackness, or is it more so about bigotry in general? Is our Indigenous community more so, I don't want to say oppressed, but for lack of a better word, treated in a manner that would be more similar to what the black community faces in America? Or is the problem one and the same for our black community here in Canada?
I think it's hard to kind of like, like weigh one is higher than the other. But like when it comes to the Indigenous communities and stats, like they're downright horrifying. In Saskatchewan, the youth incarceration, over 90% of the youth incarcerated in Saskatchewan are actually Indigenous. 90%. Um, I think it's actually much higher too. With Indigenous girls, like youth, I think it's like almost like 96 or 97%. It's ridiculous. I encourage people to just look that up. When it comes to the black incarceration rate, it's also gone up. Between 2006 to 2016, the black incarceration rate went up, I think, between 60 to 70%. So we also have overrepresentation problems. What a lot of people do, though, which I think is a mistake, is they often say that, yes, when it comes to policing in prisons, there is a problem here, but it's only for Indigenous people, similar to Black Americans in the US. Yes, that's also a problem here, but we have a black incarceration rate. And the reason I think it's not really looked at that much is because of the lack of data. 2017 was a huge moment because data came out across Canada showing that, yes, this was a problem. And I think the origin of this movement that we're seeing now, or that this moment, goes back to 2017, because that's when a lot of these experiences were validated. Because before, because there's no data, politicians could say there's no problem, police forces could say there's no problem, but then this data existed, and back then it was tough. Like I remember back then when I was part of Black Lives Matter, just saying Black Lives Matter gave me professional consequences. I know for a fact I lost out on jobs. Personal consequences. I got so many death threats. Like it's just ridiculous. And the whole anime neo-Nazi thing, to touch on that, like I'm on, like, people read about me on white supremacist forums, but there's one where it's literally like an anime forum, but also like Nazis. It's really ridiculous. But they actually wrote a hard article about
Pick
me,
your
like
lane, guys.
But anyways,
Yeah.
yeah. But anyways, like, but I guess the key point is back then it was much more controversial to be a part of Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Now it's actually a bit heartwarming to see how accepting it is, like, to put out that statement. It's a little, I do have mixed feelings about people co-opting it. However, at the very least, the Overton window has shifted, and these policy proposals, which would have seemed radical back then, are now seen as more reasonable.
Hmm.
So I think, if anything, that's the actual benefit of this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because the conversations that I'm having with some of my more conservative friends now is that, I hope, like, what they're saying to me is basically, I hope you realize that this is nothing more than a political, agenda item for the Democratic Party. And it's like, okay, at the end of the day, I think policy change is exactly what we're looking for. So, I mean, if this is a political issue, then don't really see what the problem is with that. But do you think that there is a risk in this being politicized, and is that a bad thing?
I think it's already political. I think when we speak about police misconduct, police brutality, like, those in themselves are very political issues. I think at the very minimum, Friday's protest was not very political. Like, it was people speaking very generally about racism they experience, which is totally valid. However, I think there needed to be more of a focus on local politics, because in that moment you had the opportunity to educate 10, 15,000 people, which is surreal, which is like something I could have never imagined. Like, I give class talks, I speak to high schools, I speak to universities. I think at most I've maybe reached maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 people. So that's like literally my life's work. And in that one moment, in that like 90 minute thing, 2 hour thing, there's an opportunity to reach those people. Nevertheless, there will still be a renewed focus on this. I think, especially in the next week. Like I don't think this is going away for at least another week or two.
I mean, but
If I'm being pessimistic.
but
Sorry, go
what
ahead.
would be that message though? I mean, you've touched on it a couple of times that you would have hoped that more of a local message would have been communicated. What specifically do you think people need to know about Edmonton?
Yeah, so I think maybe it makes sense if I go down each level of government.
Sure.
When it comes to the province, what people need to know is how the province is responsible for policing. Like they're responsible for the Police Act, which governs police oversight. So right now, police investigate themselves essentially. Like if there's a police misconduct case, it's a police officer that actually investigates the case. If it's more serious, it actually goes to ACERT, which is also made up of cops. But anyways, like that's a huge issue. Like we could push for models like BC and Ontario, which have independent civilian oversight agencies, but also making sure that they're well funded. Because ACERT right now, they actually do good work, even though they're cops. The problem is that they're so underfunded that in many cases, in cases, they actually have to defer the investigation to another agency, and all they do is actually review it. So on the provincial level, those are things we can actually be pushing. Also education too, with the curriculum. Black history isn't really taught here, even though we have a rich civil rights history. Like Lulu Anderson, who was a black woman that sued a theater on Jasper Avenue for refusing her entry. Charles Daniel, who did the same thing in 1914 in Calgary. And he did it. And in 1914 is actually the same year Viola Desmond was born, and Viola Desmond is now on our $10 bill. So those are things that can happen provincially that I think there's opportunity to have actually been talked about. When it comes municipally, and when it comes to city council is responsible for the Edmonton Police Service budget. So the city council could be pushing for things like ending carding, like implementing body cameras. You know, those those are just a couple issues, but they're really powerful. Unfortunately, though, and this gets into like technical stuff, the reason why city council doesn't comment on stuff is because of the police commission. The police commission is an oversight body made up of two city councilors and random citizens. City council appoints everyone. So city council appoints two councilors, and they also interview and actually appoint citizens. Unfortunately, they use that as a cover to actually not speak out on this stuff, even though there's nothing preventing them from speaking about policing issues. They use that as a cover. So city council does have things they could actually do, such as carding, but also body cams. School boards. You can even go down to the school board level. School boards are responsible for school resource officers, who are police officers in schools. They're in, I think, almost every high school. They recently put them in junior highs, and their goal is to put them in elementary schools. Not a lot of people know this, but school boards actually pay the Edmonton Police Service. They pay 42% of a school resource officer's salary. So if a constable who works 5 years makes 100 grand, that's 42 grand they're paying the Edmonton Police Service for one cop. Think about how much more effectively that money could be spent. Now, there's other issues I can get into, but those are just some examples on each level of government.
No, well, I mean, unless one of you guys wants to touch more deeply onto that specific issue, I just wanted to ask one thing that you brought up a little bit earlier, which was the case here in Edmonton, which was determined that the police used, a reasonable force on the gentleman that was under a similar circumstance to George Floyd. Do you know, and again, this is something that's starting to become more into the conversation with the prosecution of the cops that were, both involved directly and passively with the Floyd case, this idea of the Graham ruling and, reasonable cop test, if you will, right? Was the cop
Yeah,
reasonable in their actions given a specific
yeah,
frame of time right before the act occurred? Does that similar standard exist here in Canada?
yeah. So the Canadian standard is actually kind of ridiculous. So the guy actually filed a policeman like a complaint, like an officer complaint. The way it works in Edmonton is that if you file a complaint, it actually so I've also done this too. So the way it works is you file a complaint, then somebody calls you and they ask if you want a formal investigation. They heavily pressure you to go the informal route. The informal route is basically You meet with the cop, or the cop supervisor finds a way to give some professional consequence or whatever, and it's usually relatively minor. It's usually like a warning. They heavily pressure that. I don't know what the stats are, but I would bet you that a huge number of cases, if not the majority, are actually not referred to formal investigation. Now, if it does go to a formal investigation, an officer actually goes through the case, they put together a report, and then it goes to the chief of police. This is where it gets messed up. The chief of police is the one who decides if the case actually has merit and a reasonable success for
Wow.
there to actually be conviction, or for the officer to actually be punished.
So there's no grand jury,
So you
nothing.
have, yeah, so there's no independent non-police person who actually decides this. It's the chief of police who decides if it goes forward or not. Here's where it gets even more messed up. If they decide it doesn't go forward, and I'm actually working on a case right now where the misconduct case admitted that the officers are wrong, but the chief of police said that it wasn't reasonable for there to be an actual misconduct, charge or whatever. So if the police chief dismisses it, it then goes to the law enforcement review board, which is provincial, and they actually review it. The problem is that takes a lot of time, and I actually don't know what the degree of success is. So within that system itself, there's a ton of problems. In my personal opinion, if there's a use of force complaint, it should always go to investigation. Always, they should never ever try to make it informal. The chief of police should have no part of this. Like he's literally a cop. Like it should be an independent person who decides whether or not there's merit. And then finally, the appeal process should also be independent. It should also be made up of citizens who are not related to policing at all. So I hope that kind of explains how complaints and stuff work in Edmonton when it comes to use of force and how the process is. Oh, the other thing too, sorry, is it's really in Canada, like you know how in the US they suspend officers without pay? That's almost impossible to do like in Canada. Like in Ontario, there's some of their officers who've sometimes even been convicted of stuff who actually still are getting paid. So in many ways, Canada is actually behind on this.
Is that like a union thing or?
Yeah. Police unions are this is a whole nother topic, but police unions in Canada are very powerful. I'll just put it that way. And they're also like very key for like spreading a lot of this PR. Like I have to hand it to police. Like they're really good at portraying themselves. It's actually kind of weird. The only time they messed up was the whole carding
Mhm.
thing. Their media game was way off. I think they thought that they could do their traditional talking points of like saying we're compassionate, we don't do this, but because we had data, they weren't able to do that, so they were caught off guard. It was actually kind of wild. I remember sitting down with the deputy chief after that all happened, and I asked him how many like media people he has, and I think he said like six or something, and it could have actually been higher, but that actually threw me off because we were doing all of our media, Black Lives Matter Edmonton, with like me. It was basically me and Rikesh,
Mm-hmm.
and we're not getting paid for anything, and we were able to outmaneuver them. So their PR is good, but if it's under just a little bit of scrutiny, it just falls apart completely because it's rooted in people not knowing about these problems. But when you do know about these problems, it becomes much easier to challenge, to challenge these policies and to challenge these programs.
So that being said, I think you had mentioned that you have in the past, when you were involved with Black Lives Matter, suffered consequences for stating that and being a part of that movement. But now, it's a little more trendy, for lack of a better word, to be a part of that movement and to kind of buy into that idea. What are your thoughts on like how it has become more of a mainstream thing? And while that's really great in a lot of ways because it's reaching a lot more people, do you feel that there are consequences to that in terms of, moments of solidarity or movements that kind of can get sidetracked or co-opted in other ways?
Yeah, I think there'll be like minor bumps in the road that'll happen. So like I don't know if you saw, there's like videos of like Instagram influencers taking photos of themselves at protests. Organizers who are starting from this, like this will inspire a generation of organizers. They will mess up. I messed up when I started doing this stuff, like when I was 17. There would definitely be bumps in the road, and I also still mess up too. Like I'm definitely not perfect. So, but I think if there's any like major consequence, it'll be what I mentioned before, which is the momentum being lost. Now there is the danger of like the messaging being watered down, but this is kind of weird. Like usually they're pretty good, and by they, sorry, I mean police, but also other forms of media are usually pretty good at kind of twisting the message when it comes to BLM. But that hasn't really
I
happened
mean, there's
here.
been a
Like,
lot though of like quote unquote propaganda out there. Like when you see videos on Twitter, cops
oh,
kneeling with everyone and singing
oh,
"Kumbaya."
100%. But we're still talking about police defunding. If that stuff was successful, then the whole defunding police thing, I think, would be thrown out the window. So yes, like there are videos and stuff of cops kneeling, which I think is like messed up. Because sorry, I just want to reiterate the Edmonton example. They were kneeling on Friday, the same week they justified kneeling on a black man's neck. So it just shows how kind of wild it is. But I think if there's any negative thing is that the momentum's lost. I think this is a huge, I guess, cultural moment, and at the very minimum, I think there'll be, I don't know what type of change it'll be, but I assume that there will be change.
So let me just ask one thing. This is a personal thing between me and some friends, and I'm sure you've had very similar conversations in your circles there.
Hmm.
As someone who's you're prominently out there, you're outspoken, you make sure that your opinions are heard, and people know you for that. People know where you stand on most things when you're out there and out and about. uh we can't say a lot for that with our friends, our family. Like, I know for a fact my parents might not speak out the same way that I am, and my dad has a saying that he would say: if you are young and you aren't progressive, you have no heart. And he said, if you are old and still move as a progressive, you have no brain. And a lot of the sentiment in our communities or in our families, people choose either a not to speak out because they feel they don't have the same tie to the issue. And then there's the other side of the coin where we have people from coming out the wazoo from high school, from junior high, probably hitting your phone up too, all day and night, asking you questions, comments, concerns. Hey, what should I do? Hey, how can I be a proper ally? Hey, how
Yeah,
can I be your buddy through this tough times? If I get one more message of concern checking in on me, if I see one more message, hey King, how you doing right now? I'm gonna lose it. And I just want to know, like, what is your take on what is appropriate quote unquote allyship? Like, how should, to the folks that are listening that might not identify as black, how can they be an ally?
yeah. I think the number one thing is interrogating their actions and interrogating what they've done. So, for example, for any non-black person that showed up on Friday, I think they should ask themselves why they showed up there,
Hmm.
and if they feel that it was in any way to absolve them of guilt, if they left feeling heartwarmed. I saw a post, Instagram post, Twitter post of people saying it was heartwarming. I've never, in my experience, left a protest feeling heartwarmed. Like maybe sometimes I felt pride that we were a little bit successful, but I've always felt a little uneasy because there's still work to do. A protest, I think, for many people, they see it as some sort of end goal, when in reality, it's just a tactic. So when it comes to allies and stuff, I think that's the number one thing. It's reflection. Because I said this before, but the first step is solving a problem is by understanding that there is one. So if you understand that, okay, maybe I wasn't coming at it from the right place, then at that point you're able to, I think, be more effective. And in my mind, in this moment, the most effective thing is staying engaged in the long term. Because right now there's groups forming, and not a lot of them really know what they're doing, to be honest. Because I have to keep this in mind. There was very few people doing this work in Edmonton before this
Hmm.
moment, and then this moment happens, and suddenly we're
Hmm.
overwhelmed. Um, as we're speaking, I'm literally getting messages from people who actually want to help, who want to organize. Black people, non-black people, whatever. Keep that energy
Yeah.
going. 2 months from now, 3 months from now, 4 months from now, 5 months from now, because it will, I think, wane. Like I think that this interest will go down. But if you're an ally, if you're someone who I think is truly interested in justice, then it has to be beyond this
So
moment.
then let's look at the other side of this. So that's the role of the ideal quote unquote ally, right? And so where does the onus fall on us, on me?
Okay, wait. Before we dive into that, because I do want to dive into that, but I don't want to move away from this allyship conversation quite yet, because I mean, I'm trying to be that, right? I mean, speaking from a non-black perspective, I think sometimes, a lot of times, even within my circle of friends who are, I've got a lot of black friends, I've got a lot of non-black friends, right? And I think specifically with my fellow South Asian friends, um, there's a lot of conversation happening right now as to how, like, what is the right approach, right? And I to me, and I think, Bashir, you reiterated, there's very few people who are perfect in this world in terms of how they go about tackling any subject matter. This being, the most preeminent one in the global conversation right now. So I think we're all kind of trying to be as best of an ally as we can. Do you not think that sometimes, and I don't think this is just with the black community, I think this is everybody with every cause ever. Do you think there's sometimes a quick judgment that happens and we're quick to cancel a lot of newcomers to movements? And is that not more problematic in the long? Man, I'm using all these words that I absolutely hate, like cancel culture, problematic. I hate these words, but anyway. But
Yeah.
do you not think that is a long term negative towards the movement? Should the approach not be to encourage people, even if it is the first time they're engaging with this sort of a movement, or educating themselves in some way? Should the responsibility not be to further allow them an opportunity to be a part of something like that, or is it too late, or too little, too late?
I mean, I definitely think non-black people can be a part of this movement. When it comes to like what you're talking about, um, I because a lot of that I think involves watering down a message, like in order to make non-black people feel more comfortable, which is what happened Friday. Like, to be honest, like there was a lot of focus on like white people in in many of the speeches, and I won't talk about specifics, but um, I don't think you necessarily have to water down the message. I think at the end of the day, there needs to be, I guess, a different understanding of the process of, I guess, being an ally. Because when I give talks, and I've given like tons of talks on Black history, what I noticed when I started giving talks was that a lot of people were just leaving like feeling shame or whatever. But the thing is like that's so I actually specifically changed my talks. I didn't water down the talks, but I talked about the future, like the way forward. And I mentioned how I mentioned in all my talks how you may be feeling shame or whatever. That's on you. That's a valid emotion. However, shame is not a useful emotion. You know, like yes, feel it. Yes, work through it. And if you're only feeling shame because you don't feel like you're doing enough, if you feel like you know the messaging is too intense or whatever, then 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 that's on them to work through. What needs to happen is that I guess people need to move beyond that, move beyond that sense of shame, and be driven towards some type of action. The most useful allies I've ever seen are people who just want to get down to the work. But the important thing to note is that they've never disregarded how they felt. Sometimes I have conversations with them and they'll tell me, yeah, I feel kind of weird, being in this position. I feel shameful because I grew up, with so much privilege, so much money, whatever. But so they've acknowledged that they've never cast that they never cast that away, because people who try to, I guess, push back against the shame or are overwhelmed by it get burnt out very quickly, and those are the people who are not able to stay in for the long term. The most useful allies have been people who process those emotions and have just done the work. There's one person I'll mention specifically, actually. When the Justice for Mel stuff was happening, we picked her as the police liaison. So basically, what that role is if cops come up, her entire job is to distract the cops so that we can get out of there and not get arrested. But she's like this 5 foot tall white girl, and we made her the police liaison. We also gave her a special job. So I guess for some context, one of our protest tactics was to come in and do a silent protest with signs. But they didn't allow us to bring signs in. So what we did is we gave her the signs, and she walked in. They didn't check her bag. She walked in, and as the meeting was happening, she slowly handed out the signs. And yeah, and we were able to do that protest. I know for a fact she felt guilt. I know for a fact she felt shame. But in every action we did, she never really brought it up with us, right? She worked through those emotions on her own or through her friends, and she was driven towards action, like being as useful as possible, but also, I guess, using her privilege. So at the end of the day, like when it comes to if somebody is actively bullying volunteers, I think that's bad. I don't think that should happen. I think if somebody is uh, critiquing someone, it should be with something that's, I guess, valid, like race, privilege, and all that is valid to talk about. But no one should really make it about personal politics, which unfortunately I think is an issue with Edmonton and social activism. The social activist community in Edmonton is very small, at least before this moment, and a lot of it comes from it, and a lot of it suffers from infighting, which means that some people, um, I guess, I don't know, some people are seen negatively for one way, some people are seen as like not doing enough, some people are seen as like doing too much, some people are seen as like being very self-serving, self-promoting, and I think that's a problem, and I definitely acknowledge that. But most of the shame that people tell me that they get is not necessarily from that, but it's from feeling a sense of, guilt or whatever. So at the end of the day, like, those are valid emotions. Work through them. Don't let anyone bully you. But at the end of the day, be driven to action, because I can tell you that after that protest, like, she was on a high. You know what I mean? Like, it was actually kind of wild to see like someone that giddy because they were able
Use
to
their
do
privilege.
something
Yeah.
meaningful. And it took a while. Like, that was like, I think a few weeks of them actually being a part of our group.
I had this discussion with Sikandar over Instagram a few days ago, and he didn't let me finish saying my point. He was like, "Stop, save it for the podcast." So, so I guess I'm kind of one of those people who I was actually at the Black Lives Matter protest in 2014, I think it was, where I saw Rakash speak, and I like kind of saw that it was, outside of the Citadel Theater. It was this tiny little congregation of people. I was one of the few non-Black people who were present. And I guess for me trying to be an ally, I've been very like the thing basically that started the conversation between Sikandar and I was that I posted on Blackout Tuesday, and I just shared this thing from one of the Instagram activists that I follow, who was like, if your posting of this black square is not followed by advocacy and donating and confronting anti-Blackness and everything within yourself, then it doesn't mean anything. And I still very firmly believe that, because I think, especially
just to add to that, I think it also said, just to be clear, I think it also said, like, if this is the first time you're posting, then like it doesn't really matter. No, because there was like multiple parts to that. Because I remember you were like, keep swiping. I was like, well, but like the first image was very... But anyway, keep
okay,
going.
But so I don't think
there's two parts. There was definitely two parts to it. There was like if you haven't done anything up until this point, we don't want you. And then also keep going for definitely.
I'm going to read that again, because I did read it again the other day, because I had this discussion with my best friend too, and I was like, what are your thoughts? And she was on your side, but that wasn't why she was on your side. But basically, I guess just seeing, because like for me, I'm not Black. I don't live this reality every single day, but I think wanting to have been an ally for this much and not really knowing what to do with it, I'm tired, because I have these conversations with these people in my life all the time, and I can't even, like, it doesn't even directly affect me in the same way. And so for me, it's like, I can't breathe were the words that Eric Garner said in 2014. And now I can't breathe are the words that George Floyd said in 2020. And like, what has changed? So I guess for me, I'm just really like, you know what, like, thank you for being here, but also like put your money where your mouth is, put your action where your mouth is. And I think that there's some people who I think are now engaged in the movement, and it's the bare minimum, in that people who I have like heard say racially charged things or like witness just not be their best selves have been posting these black squares onto Instagram and being like, ooh, like I care about this movement. And I think we need those people. Like, we need white allies, we need non-Black people of color allies, like we do, to advance the movement. And you just gave a really wonderful example with your story of how those people can use their privilege to help further the movement. So like, by no means do we want to alienate them, but that being said, like, I think it's really fair that a lot of the Black people that I know are just so tired, because this has been going on for so long, and they're like, I don't have the energy or the patience to have to educate you or like water this down, or to like give you props and gold stars for doing what should be like what you're doing anyway, and what you should have been doing this whole time. And so, I mean,
Yeah.
I know, and I had this really good discussion with my really good friend too, because she was like, but isn't it good that those people are engaged? Like, even if this is just the tipping point, at least they're talking about it, at least they're thinking about it. Even if all they did today was post a black square, isn't that a tiny bit of a win? And I was like, I was like, well, shit, maybe. Sorry, take out the shit. But I was like, well, maybe, but also
Yeah.
like if it's not accompanied with like this person confronting their own anti-blackness, talking to their families, donating their money, like showing up for things, like does
Yeah, the
it mean
question is, I guess, like
anything?
how much is enough?
Yeah, and it's like
Yeah.
I guess for me, like posting a black square like wasn't even step 1. Like that wasn't even a step. Like I'm sorry, that wasn't. But if along with that there was like, let's think about how my privilege has affected my life and how, let's actually talk about this stuff with my friends and family, then I'm like, okay, that those are the steps. But yeah, is the square enough? Because at least it's like on their minds now, and at least it's like in the back of their psyche when they're reading these articles and when they're reading the news and when they're looking at these stories.
Hmm. I think I think one thing to kind of, I guess from my perspective, is for people to understand that yes, when it comes to like non-black allies, we need them, but we don't need a majority. Like when it comes to the civil rights movement, a lot of people think like Martin Luther King had like a majority of like white people supporting him, but 64% of people uh, um, thought that he was actually hurting the civil rights movement. Actually, sorry, no. The stat in I think it was 1963 or 1964 was actually 74% thought that he was hurting the civil rights movement and actually thought protests and sit-ins were actually negative. So even though he had like white people on his side, and everything, a lot of the movement was organized by black people, and there were there were white people, but he made sure to not kind of craft the movement around them. And I'm not sure if you noticed, but I guess throughout this conversation, I tried to not like really focus too much on people who may have not been that genuine on Friday's protest. Like I think that's a discussion to have on that, and I definitely you know don't like I guess people who I don't know are kind of doing the bare minimum. However, it's important to understand that like we shouldn't I think be spend too much time worrying about that. If we build a good movement, if we build a good movement with strong messaging, then people will naturally come and naturally join. It's the same thing with Justice for ML. We started with like literally me and one other person. It grew to a small team of like about 10, and then by the time it ended we had like dozens and dozens of people who wanted to be a part of it because we were close to victory. So at the end of the day, I think yes, small acts are good, and I think even people posting a square or whatever that does shift the Overton window. But when it comes to like activism and actual like work on the ground, at the end of the day, that will always be done by a small minority of people. But that small minority can be a mix up of any group of people, and I think if you're an ally or whatever, like it doesn't exclude you from being a part of that. Just like that person I mentioned, and I'm using them as an example because they never I guess centered themselves when it came to their emotions or anything. But that person, like they came from a pretty privileged background, like super religious, like very fundamental, and also sorry, I'll explain a little more. They came from like the Mormon faith, and the Mormon faith up until like the 70s, they straight up said that black people were not go to heaven. So this person was able to do so much and didn't ask for any awards or anything, and they were still a part of our core
Okay.
team. But at the end of the day, I think the movement, if it's about anti-black racism, will be built by black people, and if the messaging is good, then I think you don't really have to water it down for really anyone. People would naturally join.
So now going back to what Omar was touching on before, I mean, this is a conversation that we've been having a lot with the Mosquers team because we're trying to figure out how we can make meaningful change, and we're starting to really deep dive into what steps we need to take to get more representation of the Black community within our board. And the conversation we were having was, we've tried to reach out to whether it's the Somali Student Association or individuals within the Black community to say, you know what, this platform is as much for you as it is for anybody else. Come and be a part of it. And Omar and I were touching on that topic earlier about, how much of that responsibility is on us as kind of mainstream organizations and how much of that is on the Black community to want to be a part of these organizations. And so, Omar, I don't know if you wanted to touch on that any
Yeah,
further, but
like basically the same sentiment that kind of rings through. At what point, uh, for example, with the protests, the sit-ins, everything that's happening, like how much of a role do the oppressed play in freeing themselves from the oppression? Is the point that I was trying to get to beforehand there. Like, should I really be offended by I'm not asking how I should feel about things, but I'm saying how do you feel? Because I'm of the opinion like, you know what, you have enough on your plate right now. There are people out there doing the work, but at the same time, I know no one will fight for me and my rights harder than I would for myself and my community would. So should we be directing that, keeping that same energy to our own friends and neighbors the same way that we do to Tom, Dick, and Harry?
I think for a black organizer, almost all their energy should be spent on black issues. The more time I think we spend on, trying to make the movement more acceptable or trying to, get like non-black people in the movements, I think that waters down the movement. Um, I remember Malcolm X like talked about, or sorry, what was it? Yeah, Malcolm X like was asked if he would ever accept white people in his movement, and he said no. But if John Brown applied, then maybe we would consider. If you don't know who John Brown was, like this dude like started like a revolt against like slave owners. Like he literally picked up a gun and like went on like rebellions and stuff. And as he was hanged, and actually he was one of the key reasons for why the Civil War happened. So, anyways, there's actually a song called John Brown's Body. It's a whole thing, but those cases are rare. At the end of the day, like it will be like black organizers who actually do this work, who are actually in key leadership
and I
roles.
and I completely appreciate that stand of, for a Black organization that's got very specific agenda items that need to be addressed. You don't want to have to cater to a non-Black audience given the organization's mission, right? I get that completely. But what about the inverse? What about organizations like us, which is trying to be a platform for ethnic groups of all types that fall under the banner of Muslim, that has widely failed at tapping into the Black community? How much of that responsibility is on us, and how much of that responsibility is on the Black community to want to be a part of organizations like that?
I think it's mostly on the organization because if you build an organization that is, I guess,
Inclusive and people want to be a part of the people who go there, you know?
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And it takes like a strong effort. It could be like small stuff like language. Like for example, how is stuff promoted? Is it promoted in Somali? Is it promoted in, I don't know, like any other like language that's spoken in a black majority Muslim country, for example, when it comes to the Mosquers at least. So I think a lot of it is on the organization. I think the other thing too is like right now a lot of organizations are rushing to get black people to be a part of it just because of this moment. I know for a fact I have like some friends in journalism who are actually being offered like full-time jobs, and I remember one person gave them the advice to actually not take those, if they can, to not take those offers, because at the end of the day, that's not going to be a good workplace if they're only hiring you to kind of escape this moment. So I think, and I know this is very vague, and I apologize for this, but it's if you build an organization that, I guess, I don't want to even necessarily say inclusive, but empowers black people, then you will have black people come. And this stands for any other demographic group. So I hope that makes sense. And yeah, I'm sorry for it being a little
No.
vague.
I mean, listen, it's something that we've also come to terms with, right? And we had a lengthy conversation earlier today with some of our other Black members of our team about exactly that: the efforts that have failed in the past, and how we do not repeat mistakes, but instead make systematic changes to our organization to make sure that we become more representative of the Black community, to make sure that we actually provide a real platform. So, I mean, I'll be the first to admit, as chair of this organization for the last 3 years and now co-chair with Sofia, that the efforts that we undertook under, quote unquote, my leadership failed. I mean, without a doubt, they failed. This was the first year in which we've had more than one Black member of our 29-person board. I mean, it's just unacceptable. So I completely take it on the nose full on that we need to do better, and that there's significant steps that need to be taken to make this organization, the Mosquers specifically, a more empowering organization. So no offense is taken there whatsoever. It's entirely, I think, just a matter of learning how we can do that, right? And I think that's part of the ongoing conversation that we need to have. But Sophia, you were going to say something.
No, I wasn't.
Oh,
I was just cheering you on over
okay,
here. I was
sorry.
like, great
I saw your
job.
hand go up, so it's like
No.
no.
I was high-fiving you from a distance.
Right on. There you go. Amazing. I feel like that's a bit of a natural break, unless any of you guys have anything further that you wanted to touch on with Bashir. But that's an hour 15. He's given significantly more time than we had originally agreed to. So we sincerely appreciate that, man. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much for taking the time out of what I am sure is a busy schedule, being bombarded with all sorts of requests to take the time to do this one. So thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay, Bashir, thank you so much, man.
Great. Well, take care.
All right. Omar, thank you again for bringing Bashir onto the podcast. I think that was, I speak for myself, I think that was very educational, especially as it relates to the local and national conversation around anti-Blackness here in Canada, as well as the relationship between the police and our Black community. So, again, it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, right? Like, a lot of people here in Canada do not consider this a Canadian problem.
Yeah, at all.
Yeah.
At all. Even in our own communities, we don't see it as a Canadian problem. We don't see racism as an issue. It's more something that, we see it when we open up our phones, but as soon as we close it, it's not really there anymore. The closest thing that we do all kind of agree on is Islamophobia. We agree that that's out there, but racism, especially racism within the community, we just don't see that as a thing per se, and we're trying to make that loud. I think people have been getting that across.
And more specifically than even Canada, I would suggest that our Muslim community has a real problem with this as well, and something that as an organization we've tried to at least acknowledge, and I think something that a lot of organizations are perhaps struggling to acknowledge is the level of racism that occurs within the Muslim community, whether that's within the South Asian community, the Arab community, or otherwise. How do we do better? I know that's a very, very loaded, big question, and I fully appreciate the fact that it's not on our Black community to educate us, but for out of a place of ignorance more than anything, how do we as Muslims, and again, I'll keep the conversation framed towards Muslims and Muslim organizations, how do we become more inclusive?
I would say first and foremost, it starts with, and I'm not here to speak on behalf of all Black folks out there, these are what my personal opinions are, and from the conversations I've had with folks in the community and things like that, it does really start amongst ourselves in our little circles with your aunties and uncles. Like I got plenty of Desi friends and plenty of friends from all around the world, right? And the sentiment that's out there on how we are spoken of within those communities is pretty unanimous all across the board, and even from that little that first off, that talk that Hassan Minaj did a few days ago was hit it bang on. And I remember having that talk with a friend from Pakistan, and he was telling me, the word that we have for you guys it's not a nice word. You guys can attest to it. But then I'm not here to call out other people on things that I know damn well Somali folks and Black folks do too. I know that the word that we have for people that come from either China, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, having Asian characteristics is Indoyar, which is those with small eyes. Where we have for Arabs is Dagas, the ones whose ears turn red. I don't know where these things come from, but it's within our own community. It's from the community outside of us. It's something we have to work within and without. So I think first things first, it is just talking with folks, like talking to your immediate family, talking within your community. And it's not a nice conversation. It's not a fun conversation to have. Shit,
We're mature individuals here.
we're just as tired of having it. I know a lot of people I've had the same sentiment with as swiping through their stories are tired of seeing BLM pop up every other story, every other post, and then as soon as you see someone put up an actual selfie right now, you're like, ooh, nah, read the room. What are you doing? There is a time that I think we will all look back on as we get older, when we are in our 50s and our 60s, and we can say that we were a part of something in changing the narrative, and that these are ideally conversations that I won't have to have with my kids, the same way how I know my little brother is having serious discussions about race in his junior high school. And I'm hoping this is something that can be realistically a thing of the past at some point in the near future. I'm so happy that people are talking about it right now. It is everywhere. It is so in your face that you can't avoid it. When I'm getting work emails come to me from everyone that I've had random conversations with from different floors, and having it be this worldwide, this out there, I feel like some good will come from it. I'm hoping good comes from it. And the things that we can do directly to bring change to the right direction, I'm sure you guys are all aware, whether it's having conversations, sharing information that's out there, proper readings, making sure that people are getting educated and becoming familiar with it. Make it as common of a topic as Islamophobia is within the Muslim community. The same way how we all collectively agree that Islamophobia is real and is out there from the world, embrace that racism exists. I don't know what more else I can say.
No, it's true. And so Sophia, I'm gonna stop talking and let you interject
It's
here in a
cool,
second.
no, it's
But
cool.
one thing I did want to touch on was maybe it was never just said so plainly before, but again, like Fatima today was just we were talking on our director's channel on Slack, or maybe it was on a different channel, I don't know, but basically what she said was that it's that covert racism within, whether it's Desi circles or Arab circles or whatever, that is so apparent to Black people that we don't even recognize is there. But like really, we recognize it. We just don't consider it a big deal, right? It's like, I mean, what's the big deal, So how much of that do you think is like playing a part in keeping us all kind of in our own little individual bubbles, right? Because again, this is a problem that exists not just with one ethnic group within the Muslim community. It's every ethnic group. Everybody's kind of doing their own thing in their own circles. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way in which we verbalize different things, right? We think it's okay to say certain things, but we don't even realize that people are uncomfortable being in our presence because of those certain things that we think is totally okay to say. Do you think that's, and I guess I'll open this question to both of you. How much of that is a specifically, do we have to be conscious of that on an anti-Black level, or is that just something we're generally needing to be better about, right? Because we see that, we see those pockets exist with every ethnic group. Like Desis hang out probably as much with Arabs in the city as they do with Black people, which is to say not much at all, and I don't know. I mean, I'm struggling to understand how we can better build those bridges, because our organization, if any, should be the one to do so.
It is our organization that should be the one that's doing, every organization, every Muslim organization should feel as if though this is their problem to deal with. They're the only ones dealing with it, and act as if they're the only ones on the streets marching. The same way how people who have been marching for Black Lives Matters, like Bashir has for whoever knows how many years at this point, when he said, I was out there when there's only 4 or 5, 10 of us, he feels the burden of an entire movement on his shoulders, and he's still going in day by day feeling like I'm fighting the good fight. That's why he's saying when I left protest, I didn't feel warm-hearted. We should all feel that same heavy weight, because if we're keeping it a buck, it wasn't. I've been called the N-word a handful of times by white folks, or like non-POCs in my life. The majority of the times when I was young, it's always been brown kids in my class, the Arab kids in my class that are the ones using it around us. They're the ones that call us. From stories that I've heard in the last 2 days, the last week in my community, how many people who grew up being called Abid at the masjid kid. There's a kid that told me his nickname by his teacher when he was in junior high was Monkey in here in this city. And like the main people that we interact with at the end of the day, I'm not going to dinner all the time with Jonathan. All right. I'm sitting down with people from my community and within the Muslim sphere. You know, they're the people that we interact with the most, and they're the ones that we face it from the most if we're keeping it a buck. You know, yes, institutional racism is a thing, and that does hinder us, but I don't feel institutional racism on a daily basis, but I see it when and I'm reminded of it a lot more from my own community. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, I'm going to say some things. You let me know what you think. Because I think like, colonialism had its ripple effects in the sense of making any proximity to whiteness more valuable. And we see that in any places that were colonized. We see that in what started the Rwandan genocide in Africa. We see that in skin bleaching creams in India and Pakistan. Like, we see that everywhere. And I think one of the ways that has really translated to newcomers and immigrants, families living here now in Canada, where we're like, oh, it's not an issue, is I think because we buy into this idea of a model minority. And we have a really hard time confronting our own privilege because, as you mentioned, like, we're like, oh, but like, we're an oppressed group too, so we don't have any privilege. And I think that is the first thing that we all need to realize, is that we hold a lot of privilege, whether that is economic or just skin color wise, our proximity to whiteness. Or I know for myself, like, I'm very ethnically ambiguous. People have no idea what box to put me in. And so I'm often in spaces where they will say things that they don't realize are extra offensive to me because they feel like there's no one here policing our behavior or what we say. And so the wonderful thing about that is I can use that to call it out, and I often do. But I think if I didn't recognize that, if I was just like, well, I'm a woman and I'm Muslim and I'm a person of color, and so like those three intersecting things make me not a privileged person, and so I don't have to confront any type of privilege, I think that's the harm that could come from that. Because I think within that, I do have to recognize that I have so much privilege that I need to use to help movements when in spaces when I can. So that's point number one. I think point number two is that with this whole idea that like I just lost my train of thought.
We'll come back.
We can come back to me. Come back to me.
No, but you know, something you just said, Omar, and I know you got to run soon, so we'll wrap this up ASAP. But something you just said, which like I think really resonates, is the fact that the members of our Black community and our Black Muslim community are probably experiencing those elements of racism from our own Muslim community more than they are from like the randoms on the street who are marching alongside of us. And again, I'll reiterate this, you know, over and over, which I have every time this topic has come up. The largest section of the Muslim community in America is our Black community, right? And so for us to think that this doesn't involve us as a Muslim community is just absurd, right? So how much of our narrative as like I'll you know I'll speak from my own perspective. South Asian, you know, very privileged male, grew up in Canada, went to school in the States, and now lives in Canada without much of a burden, to be frank. How much of our narrative needs to change amongst our friends and the way in which we think about the Black community, and how much of the covert racism that we touched on is the underlying factor as to why our communities do not intersect, you know, because we could be well-intentioned but poor executors, and it could completely fall on its face. So again, like I keep thinking about my circle of friends who think it's fine to drop the N-bomb because we're people of color, and like, you know, it's in songs, so if they didn't want us to say it, then they wouldn't put it in there. It's like, come on, don't be so tone deaf today. You know what I mean? Like, but like, it's like, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do people of color get a pass, or is it one and the same?
They don't. They really don't. I'm not gonna lie. I have a poem that I wish I could do if I had the time right now. It's about the N word. You know, like the whole idea of, why can't I say it? It's generally, I wrote it intentionally aimed at white folks at first that would say it to me in high school, you know, or people that would sing along in songs, or people that were just thought they had the black pass, you know. But a lot of it relates a lot more to my brown and mulatto friends, you know, that would say it a lot more frequently than they would, and a lot more comfortably. You know, they wouldn't second guess themselves to the same degree. And to hit on the point that you said, there's a really good book that I'd recommend reading. Why are the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? It's full title. It hits on this a lot better than I could summarize it here in the next minute or so. But at the end of the day, I think what it comes down to nowadays is nobody has the argument of ignorance anymore. You can't just say, I didn't know any better, or you can't claim ignorance anymore. Like that's beyond gone. And this nice little slogan that I've seen going around nowadays that I wish I could champion even harder of, there's no such thing as I'm not racist. You have to be actively against racism. Mm-hmm. So you have to the people that are confused about where their position is on this and what I'm allowed to do and what I can't do, don't be asking your black friends. They don't represent all black folks around the world the same way how you might not represent all folks from Asia, the same way how you might not represent all folks from Scandinavia if you're listening to this and you're from the mountains of Caucasus. Okay.
We have a huge listenership.
So like if you have a doubt, or if you have questions about this, do some search on your own, come with facts, figures, statistics, try to come with an understanding, and then we'll have a conversation. Don't come for a lesson. I'm not educated on this. I am not Dr. Umar Johnson. I cannot help you with this. And you know, go and read a damn book. Is what I'm gonna tell people.
Amen. Did you find out what your second point was yet?
I did, but it was too long, so it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right, Omar, thank you so much for joining us, my man. We appreciate all that you've done for our organization to date, and for coming on our podcast 2 times in one season.
Woo.
The only 2-time guest ever.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. With that, I think we will wrap, unless Sophia, you have any final comments?
I'm
Omar,
good.
any final
Thanks
comments
so
that you want to leave for?
Any final comments?
It doesn't have to be profound, but it can be profound.
Don't do drugs and wear your seatbelt.
Those are good final
And wash
comments.
your hands.
All right.
And yeah.
We're still living in a time of COVID.
Yeah.
Wash your hands, people. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you
so much, guys.
Thank you again for joining us for this very special episode of The Halal Gap.